Warm welcome to everyone to this second episode of this video essay. Today we are going to talk about French Revolution. This is something that is historically very close to us because Western liberal democracies owe a great deal for that period. It has had huge cultural and historical relevance and influence. Before I go to the details that actually interest me about this revolutionary period, let's have a small recap of what actually we're talking about. French Revolution was a 10-year period in France from 1789 to 99, during which a great deal of things that later became part of Western liberal democracy were first tried and experimented with. It has similarities to the situation in Athens, in ancient Greece, in Athens, before the beginning of that 200-year period of democracy in that culture, is that in both cases there was uprisal of demos, the people. But there's also something a bit different there too, because in the case of French Revolution there was a financial crisis which caused lots of social distress, poverty, hunger. And it's also worth mentioning that French Revolution, they weren't just pioneers in that sense, that about 10 years before the revolutionary era in France, the United States had got its independence, and it had inspired and continued to inspire revolutionary movements in Europe. So my focus in this video is to zoom in to the 1-year period right in the middle of this 10-year period. This year is what later was referred to as the Year of Reign of Terror, and this was from 1793 to 1794. At the heart of this historical event was a particular committee. The committee was first proposed by a National Convention, and originally the National Convention suggested that there would be 9 members in it. It was called the Committee of Public Safety. Now the question is that why was the creation of this particular committee so pivotal for the events of a Year of Reign of Terror? Well, the committee, once it had been established, it suggested some key pieces of legislation which came to establish that Year of Terror, the Reign of Terror during that 1-year period. One of these central pieces of legislation was Law of Suspects, which ordered the arrest of all open and suspected enemies of the revolution. And what was really interesting about the implementation of this piece of legislation, that it was entrusted to the different oversight committees, not to the legal authorities like we used to in our societies nowadays, that once there's a piece of legislation, usually it is judges, policemen, policewomen, police department, and courts that sort of make sure that the legislation is followed. And there's a major difference, of course, compared to the kind of like understanding that we have nowadays. We are used to think that governmental authorities implement legislation with due processes, judicial processes. Another piece of key legislation was 14 Fremer, which basically centralized and consolidated power to this committee of public safety. And national convention was completely discarded or put to the sidelines of things. Usually Robespierre is mentioned as a central figure in this committee. And in this process of leading to this undemocratization within the 10-year framework of revolution. But from my perspective, I would say more that Robespierre became sort of like a warning example, a figurehead, a scapegoat almost, maybe. And it was basically mostly done, afterwards, after these events had unfolded the way that they unfolded. He certainly was one of the members of the committee, but there were periods during which he was not there making these decisions because of his illness. And the reason why his name was picked up by posterity was the fact that he became prominent, his name became prominent at the endgame phase of this period of reign of terror. This endgame period was the time when the committee focused its tyrannical gaze to some of the members, some of the key members of the very same committee, trying to find the traitors inside. Why do I put so much emphasis on this period of guillotines and governmentally ordered violence? The first reason for my focusing on this one is that it's the key phrase of paranoia. We're going to have to talk about paranoia in order to understand why I'm so interested in this period. So, at that time, right before this 1 year period, there was a certain amount of paranoia, which paranoia in the general public, not just amongst the politicians, not just the power holders, but the general public. There was a certain amount of paranoia, which to a certain degree could even be seen as something justified. During the time, France was desperately trying to establish a new form of governance. The former king of France was executed, and when that happened, some European monarchs openly expressed that they considered the revolution their enemy and wanted to do everything in their power to make sure the revolution will fail. So, when the people in France became paranoid about exterior influence affecting the country, there certainly was good grounds to think that that could be possible. But before we move onward, we have to go more into paranoia. And here a certain nugget of knowledge from my past studies really comes in handy. This is you probably think that this is a little bit of like a surprise, coming from the left wheel, something unexpected, because it on the surface this is a completely different area of knowledge that we're talking about. I think it was Swiss psychiatric and a phenomenologist, Medard Boss, who in some part of his writing stated that the birth of paranoia in an individual usually relates to early developmental period trauma in the patient's childhood. And in this period in childhood there is this brutal cutting short or making it impossible for a child to express its own emotional needs. This trauma, after it has been harbored deep inside the psyche of a person, later on expresses itself, blooms itself in the form of paranoia. And if nobody is familiar with what paranoia is, it is part of certain psychopathologies. For instance, there is paranoid personality disorder, if I remember correctly. There are also other psychopathologies that paranoia relates to, that is part of. But in paranoia, basically, individual has delusional fantasies of people ganging up to harm them or to destroy them. Now, let's leave this on the side and go back to France at that time. If we think about the collective sentiment or atmosphere in France before the revolution era began, way before the year of reign of terror, but even before the revolution, the 10 years of revolutionary era began. When it comes to general public, there were all ingredients available around to create later something that could be referred to as a collective paranoia. So, with this in mind, let's just go back to the collective sentiments in France way before this year of reign of terror and way before the era of revolution. Those layers in the memory of the public were the layers that actually triggered this paranoia. They had all the ingredients in them. Those memories had all the ingredients in to create later this collective paranoia. So we're talking about the time when king and the institution of monarchy and nobility and the class of clergy, they were all there and they were doing well under the circumstances where the general public, the bourgeois, the butchers, the shopkeepers, had hard taxes, really huge taxes, because the king had basically led to country to the brink of economical disaster. So all these privileged classes, they didn't pay for king's mistakes, but the commoners, they did. And if this seems, unbelievable, one of the things that has remained from the revolutionary era or all the way until this day is this famous saying that Queen Marie Antoinette was told that people are starving and they should do something about it, and she responded, so people don't have bread, why don't they eat cakes? Now, there's a good possibility that this was propaganda that was fed to the general public that was very frustrated. Good chance. There's a chance that it was a propaganda, that it was never true. But the fact that it still remains for us today to talk about is that there was this huge difference between how the elites lived under the circumstances where terrible economical mistakes had been made, and how commoners lived, how much harder the economical austerity hit them than these privileged classes. So when there was this unmanaged monetary crisis going on in France, huge parts of population were facing poverty because of the tax rate. So where there is this onset of collective paranoia in the revolution and the reign of terror which then ensued, the foundation for these events were laid already way before, in the later years of King Louis XVI's reign, during which heavy taxation trusted big parts of society to the brink of poverty. But it was not just that then we had this situation. What was a fact is that the needs of the commoners, the needs of an ordinary people, were suppressed brutally. So here we come back to what Boss said about the development of paranoia in later stages of life is related to early stages where there was this brutal oppression of needs. And whereas in the case of individuals there are emotional needs, here we talk about really basic human needs that were suppressed, brutally suppressed. This interpretation fits perfectly to the when we try to understand the emergence of the year of reign of terror within that decade of French Revolution. So when we look at this 10-year period of French Revolution, there are a great deal of themes there that later on more or less became integrated to the functioning of normal Western democracies. But aside of that one, there are also themes that for us now are almost like curious historical anecdotes, something that by now has disappeared to the wastebasket of history. And one of these was the attempt to try to replace the Catholic religion with cult of reason. In this cult of reason, the Enlightenment, the reason of Enlightenment is worshipped as a deity. And of course, we can ask, what is this masculine or feminine deity of reason? What is it? What is his or her essence? Basically, what we talk about here is something very pragmatic. A very pragmatic idea of rational governing of society, which before it became a pet and loved one of the larger parts of society, was first suggested by elites, especially nobility. What is this pragmatic governance of pragmatic and rational governance of society? Let me give you some examples. Let's say that we have a medieval city, and in order for the fire brigades to do their job, it makes sense to build bigger streets, to isolate fire to only certain parts of the city if the fire catches. All this makes sense. Creating these esplanades, big avenues, bigger streets that separate single parts of the city from another. It's much more easier for fire brigades if they know that on that direction we can stop the fire from spreading. It all makes sense. It is rational to implement these kinds of policies, suggest these kinds of policies, and rebuild your cities from the basis of fire safety. Another example, Michel Foucault, in his book History of Madness, in this book he states that, first of all, during the Renaissance period, when society was dealing with people who had mental health issues, their thought was to sort of like remove these people from the hustle and bustle of the rest of the society. Sort of like let them go to the physically to the edges of society, and hence the creation of ships of fools. So people with mental problems, they were put inside these ships of fools which then sailed outside the city, and it was thought that fresh sea air would then somehow clear the impurities in them and snap them out of their madness, and they could come back as a good members of society. That all was changed in the Enlightenment era and its rationality. What happened is that government decided to have these, not prisons, but establishments, houses, in which all these cases were put, so that they could be dealt with more administrative efficiency, and also with possibly more human ways. At least that was proposed to the general public. But once again, it is pragmatical, it makes sense. That's the basic idea behind the rationalities of Enlightenment era. But after this one, let's get back to the year of Reign of Terror. In the same way, we can say it made sense to react with paranoia. That some people would say that it's partly irrational. It made sense to find and destroy potential and real enemies of the revolution. It made sense to put more heads of potential enemies of revolutions on the guillotine. But what is the difference here? That here, it makes sense, it is rational, that the reason behind becomes toxic. Here we can actually, if you want to give this more like a poetic expression, we can actually refer to a painter from the same era, painting by a Spanish painter, Goya. He has this painting or drawing from that era, which is called Dreams of Reason Produce Monsters. Because here, indeed, the reason has been put to sleep, to dream, and what comes out of this dreaming is nothing short of monstrosity. Administrative efficiency of the guillotines is coupled with unconscious forces of anger and fear. Fear for your life, fear for your family, fear for your country, fear for your security. And the results are what they are for the people who are there in France at that time. Okay, let's draw this all together. Anger and hatred are potent fuels for either collective or individual paranoia. And anger and hatred are cynically utilized by tyrants and immoral power holders. If we go back to that reign of the year of Reign of Terror, the reason why it didn't last longer than 1 year is that there was a publication which first celebrated the administrative efforts of the revolution, but later turned against this committee as journalists and started to accuse them of tyranny. So they couldn't keep this up longer than 1 year because there were more and more objections to what they were doing. And it is true that power holders during this 1 year period of horror did stoke the fears of the general public and used those fears to advance their demonic or inhuman agenda. The purpose of this video has been once again to bring awareness to something dark in the middle of this tumultuous decade of revolution. You know, we like to believe that French Revolution for us would be some sort of jubilant triumph of giving form to our present day's democracies. Well, it is that. But aside of this one, there was this darkness right in the middle of it. And we should also remember that there were similarities between these events and what happened in Athens when they got rid of their tyrant and replaced the reign of tyrant with reign of democracy. But in this situation there were forces that made it much more intense experience for people who were involved with it. And if you take anything away from this, you should remember that these dark forces of anger, fear, coupled with rationality that has gone inhuman and toxic in its application of ideas of enlightenment, are there right at the core of these birth pains of Western liberal democracies. Basically, we're talking about the same thing here that we were talking in the first episode. But this is way more uncomfortable for us, I think, because it's historically way closer to what we are today than what happened in ancient Greece. And it reminds that there is a potent force inside our democracies that are really dark, really sinister, and they have been there from the start, and there is nothing preventing these forces to show up, crop up again, and do their work of destructiveness once again. So that's all for today. In the next episode I will be focusing on United States Constitution with regards to how some of its basic principles relate to central Enlightenment ideas. And before I stop, if you like what I'm doing, you can always press the subscribe button, because that allows you to see the next episode that I will be putting out here. A reminder of that it has appeared. And if you don't want to do that yet, which I wonder why you wouldn't want to do that, but nevertheless, if you don't want to do that, you can always press the like button, because that also helps me to keep up doing these, continuing to doing these videos. That's all for today. Thank you for being here, and I see you in the next episode.